My name is Chris Paoli, Redmond Mag editor, and I am pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you to our Remote Workforce Security Summit, brought to you by Beyond Trust, PDQ, and Zoho. The editorial staff of Redmond Mag, Virtualization and Cloud Review, and AWSinsider.net have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they can come up so we can get those answered for you. During today's third session, we will be giving away an Espresso Virtu Plus Deluxe bundle, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Also, we do have resources from our sponsors Beyond Trust, PDQ, and Zoho available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Beyond Trust, PDQ, and Zoho underwriting of this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring and supporting the community and ask you to check out these resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. And last but not least, please check out our Resource Center for more information on our upcoming Tech Mentor at Live 360 in Orlando this November. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Top Remote Hybrid Workforce Security Issues. This session features Brian Posey, Microsoft MVP. Brian Posey is a freelance technology author and a 22-time Microsoft MVP. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books, created numerous full-length video training courses, and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column on redmondmag.com. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much, Chris. And yeah, with regard to the space stuff, I actually got some exciting news this morning. I found out that in a couple of weeks I'm going to be doing EVA rescue operations training. So basically what that means is I'll be in a big swimming pool with a mock-up of the International Space Station, and they're going to have a mannequin dressed in a spacesuit representing an incapacitated astronaut. And now I have to figure out how to get that mannequin all the way back to the airlock while working underwater and keeping myself safe too. And the thing that's really going to make that interesting is that in orbit, you only get 45 minutes of daylight at a time. So at least half of that's going to be taking place in the dark. So that's just a quick word about what I've been into. Let's go ahead and get into the content at hand. So what we're going to be talking about today is remote and hybrid work security. And, you know, remote work existed long before the pandemic. I remember occasionally working remotely way back in the 90s, you know, whether that meant working at home or taking a day and going to the beach and doing a little bit of work there. Remote work took on various forms, but it really came to the forefront in 2020 with the pandemic. And the thing that made that so interesting was that it happened practically overnight. And not only was it fast, but almost everybody was affected. Seemingly instantly, almost everybody found themselves working remotely, whether they had been in the habit of doing that before or not. And one of the big problems with that was that for a lot of companies, that meant implementing remote access solutions very hastily. A lot of companies, of course, already had some remote work solutions in place, but those weren't designed to handle everybody working remote all at once. So companies either had to scale up what they already had, or they had to scramble and put something new into place. And at the time, companies were essentially telling their IT staff, just make it work. I don't care how you do it, just get it done and get it done fast. So what that really meant was that a lot of money got spent on remote access solutions, and it meant that in many cases security was neglected. If I'm to be brutally honest, that doesn't mean that security is not important or that the organizations didn't acknowledge the importance of security. It's just that in that moment, continuity of business mattered more than anything else. So a lot of the rules that had always applied just kind of went out the window. The problem with that is that here we are 3.5 years later, and a lot of those remote access systems that were put into place back in 2020 are still there. So, organizations spent a lot of money to ramp up their remote and hybrid work capabilities. They're not anxious to abandon that investment. They want to see a return on that investment. And also there hasn't necessarily been a reason to go back and revisit those remote access systems. So what that really means is that if any mistakes were made or any security deficiencies exist, in a lot of cases those may still be there. So this is a really good time to go back and revisit those remote access solutions and check to make sure that remote work and hybrid work is being done in a secure manner. Now, when it comes to problems related to remote work, those problems really fall into three distinct categories. The first of those being device-level security issues, the second being infrastructure security, and the third being user security. Now, I'm not really going to be talking about infrastructure security all that much in this presentation. I'm going to focus first and foremost on user security, but I'm also going to be talking about device security, because very often user security and device security go hand in hand. It's really difficult to separate the two from one another, because if you have a user working in an insecure manner, there's a very good chance they're going to compromise their device in the process. So you kind of have to address both at the same time. Now, yes, there are security mechanisms and security solutions that focus specifically on the user or specifically on the device, and those are important because you can have user activities that don't affect the device. Likewise, you can have a compromised device that doesn't necessarily affect the user. So you do have to address those separately, but I prefer to take a holistic view of user and device security. So what are the what risks do we really need to look at here? And let's talk about this at a very high level first, and then we'll delve into these in a bit more granularity. So the first thing is risky user behavior. In other words, what is the user doing that could end up compromising the environment or causing other security problems? Then we have device-level vulnerabilities, whether or not those vulnerabilities were caused by the end user. Also, we have vulnerabilities related to the network that the device connects to, because even if the user is behaving responsibly and the device is fine, if that device is connecting over a compromised network, then there's a good chance that you're going to have problems unless you've taken measures to keep everything safe. Then we also have potential vulnerabilities tied to software that's installed on the device. And I'm not just talking about malware. I'm also talking about applications that weren't developed in a secure manner, and also the browser. Because let's suppose for a moment that you've got a user working from a personal device and they're accessing one of your organization's SaaS applications, and they're doing that through the browser. Well, if that user happens to have toolbars and malicious plugins and who knows what else installed in their browser, that could potentially cause some problems for you. So you've got to be aware of the user's browser. And that's actually a topic that we're going to be revisiting a little bit later in the presentation, because potential browser issues actually go a little bit further than that. And that's not something I necessarily want to get into right this minute, but we will revisit that. Also, there's the potential for compliance violations. And that's really going to be beyond the scope of this discussion because there are quite a few other things that I want to focus on, so we're not really going to be discussing compliance. So let's really get into it by talking about some risky end-user behaviors. As I was putting this presentation together, I started realizing something. Way back at the beginning of my IT career, I used to do end-user support for a large insurance company. And a lot of the calls that we would get regarding things not working and other problems were caused by users doing things that they really shouldn't. Now, thankfully, a lot of those problems that users caused back then really aren't an issue anymore because technology has changed and evolved mostly for the better. So those types of things don't even happen today. But what I started realizing is that even though technology changes and security changes, human nature really doesn't. So a lot of the things that went on with end users back then still happen today, even if the mechanisms used for those particular activities have changed. So what are some of the bigger problems that we see today with regard to end user behavior, particularly risky behavior? Well, the first one, probably the one that immediately comes to everybody's minds because it's super common, is that of clicking on things that they shouldn't. Generally links within an email, but it could be anything. Links in a website, who knows? Thankfully, this problem's been around long enough that a lot of users know not to click on links in sketchy email messages. But I think it's probably safe to say that we all know somebody who's really bad about this. I have one friend, for example, I won't name any names, obviously, but I have one friend that just about every time I turn around, he's calling me, telling me his computer got another virus or his credit card's been compromised or something like that. And it all boils down to the way that he uses email. He'll get a message claiming to be from a service that he uses, and it's time to renew, and he won't even look at the link. He'll just click on it, enter his credit card number, and bam, he's got a malware, his credit card number's been stolen, and that sort of thing. He's really bad about that, and I think we probably all know somebody like that. But as bad as that might be at a personal level, it's actually worse if it's a user in your organization who's doing it, because it's not just their own personal information that's being compromised. It's information related to the organization as a whole, and that affects the organization's ability to operate. So clicking on suspicious links is definitely a big example of risky end-user behavior, but it's not the only example. Another example that's very similar is opening email attachments without verification. And we've got filtering mechanisms today, and most of those attachments probably get filtered out, but some occasionally make it through. I know for me, I love when I get a message claiming to be from myself and, hey, open this attachment. This is regarding your raise, or this is from your HR department when I work for myself and I don't have an HR department. But nonetheless, users opening email attachments without verifying that those attachments are safe. That's another risky end-user behavior. The next one on the list, weak passwords. And then we have password reuse. Now, password reuse can mean a couple of different things. One is reusing the same password over and over. I mentioned the insurance company that I used to work for a long time ago. That particular company forced mandatory password changes every 30 days, but they only kept a password history of, I think it was 3 passwords or 5 passwords or something like that. So some users figured that out. So what they would do is when they were forced to change their password, they had the same few passwords that they would cycle through each time, or in extreme cases, they might simply change their password over and over in rapid succession until they could clear that password history and go back to using the password that they had been using, completely circumventing the password change mechanism in the process. So that's one example of password reuse. The other example, which is a little bit more common today and a whole lot more problematic, is reusing the same password on multiple sites. So let's say a user works for an organization, and that organization requires really long, complicated passwords. Well, that's a lot to remember. So if you've got a user who's required to remember this great, big, long, complicated password, they're probably not going to want to put a lot of effort into remembering a bunch of other long, complicated passwords that they use for other things. So they may end up using their work password on all of the different websites that they have accounts on. So that way they've only got one password they have to remember. And that's a huge problem, because if any one of those websites, it doesn't even matter which one, if any of them get compromised, then that user's credentials are exposed. And the cyber attackers know that if this user has used this username and this password on this site, they've probably used those same credentials on other sites, and those might even be their credentials for the place that they work. And so they go about trying to use those credentials to get into other things, and oftentimes it works. So password reuse is a big problem. Another risky user behavior is password sharing. Again, this one can mean a couple of different things. It can mean using the same password on multiple sites like I just talked about, or it can also mean physically sharing a password with another user, kind of the way that people do with their Netflix accounts. And I've actually seen this one in corporate environments. And the problem often stems from zero trust, the idea that users shouldn't have anything, or shouldn't have access, rather, to anything that's not absolutely necessary in order for them to do their jobs. So they've got bare minimal access to the systems that they use every day. Well, the problem with that is that sometimes the access that users have really isn't enough. There can be a disconnect between what the user feels like they need access to in order to do their job efficiently and what the organization says that they need access to. So you may have a few different users in a department that share passwords with one another because they all have access to different information, and by sharing passwords like that, they can gain access to the information that each other have, thereby making it a little bit easier to get their job done. Thankfully, this is one of those things that is relatively easy to detect and to put a stop to, but it still happens, and it's something that you need to be aware of. Another potential risky end-user behavior is ignoring software updates. We've all seen people that take steps to keep their systems from rebooting so that an update gets installed. And then ignoring security warnings. Those might be warnings from antivirus software, from their mail client, from the browser. For example, a user might type a URL incorrectly in their browser and get a message that pops up and says, hey, this is a malicious site. And the user tends to see these security mechanisms as just something that's getting in their way. So they'll look for a way to get around that warning and go to the site anyway, even though that ends up being a malicious site. As I say that, I hadn't really planned on mentioning this, but I can't help but remember an old episode of The Simpsons where Homer was online and he was trying to do something, and a pop-up came up. He's like, ooh, here's a pop-up with a cartoon moose that wants my credit card number. Okay. And I could almost see a user doing something like that. Maybe not quite to that extreme, but nonetheless. Okay, so what are some others? Storing sensitive data directly on a device. This can be a big problem for any number of reasons. One, it can make the data hard to back up. But another, if something happens to that device, then the information stored on it could be lost or it could be compromised, particularly if we're talking about a mobile device. Another risky behavior is sharing passwords or other sensitive information through chat, email, etc. I already talked about password sharing among users, but as bad as password sharing might be, it can be a whole lot worse if that password sharing is done electronically, because then you have the password in clear text floating around in an electronic format that could be intercepted. Another risky behavior is blurring the lines between personal and work resources. For example, a user might be logged on to their work account and access a personal email account while they're logged on, or a personal app or something like that. And if those resources that they're using aren't secure, then that could end up having an impact on their work data. The next one is social engineering. That refers to someone using non-electronic means to try to trick a user into giving up information. For example, an attacker might make a phone call to an organization's help desk posing as a user and ask for a password reset. And if the help desk falls for that, then they have a set of credentials that they can use to log in as the user that they're impersonating. That's an example of social engineering. And then the last one on the list, inadequate training. And I kind of have mixed feelings about this one. I've been to corporate security training events. I've been involved in some of those. And what I found is that users very often view IT security as something that gets in their way. It's a hoop that they have to jump through. It's one more thing to make their day a little bit more complicated and to just make it a little bit tougher to get access to whatever it is that they need access to. So a lot of times if there's a corporate security training, users will attend it only because they have to, but most of them will immediately disregard anything that they learned in that session. Now, having said that, you will typically have a small number of users that really take the information to heart and start applying some security best practices as a result of the information that they've learned. So is the end user training worth it when most of the end users will ignore that information? I don't know. I tend to think it is worth it because even if you only reach a few people, at least that your information or your organization is a little bit more secure than it would have been before that. There's something called the 10 Immutable Laws of IT Security. And there are a few different versions of those laws, but one of those laws, and I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember the exact way that it's worded off the top of my head, but one of those laws is that your organization will only be secure when the secure way of doing things is also the easy way of doing things. In other words, a lot of end users hate security. They're going to try to do things in the easiest way possible. They want the path of least resistance. So if you can make security transparent to your users, then you don't have to worry nearly as much about those users trying to circumvent your security in an effort to make things easier on themselves. So then we get into device-related vulnerabilities. And there are a number of device-related vulnerabilities, some of which are related to things that the users have done and some not so much. So what are some things that you have to look out for on devices? Well, it's really going to vary depending on the device platform and whether the device is owned by the organization or if it's owned by the end user, a personal device that they're working from. If it's domain joined, if it's standalone, there are a lot of what-ifs here. But some of the potential issues are lost or stolen devices, particularly if that device contains any data that can be exploited. For example, what if it's got a cached password to access your corporate VPN? That's something that might come in helpful for an attacker. Also, has the operating system on a mobile device been jailbroken or rooted? Certainly that's something to look out for. Unauthorized applications, pirated applications, and that's an issue for more than just compliance reasons. A lot of times when a cyber criminal pirates an application, they'll also take the extra step of embedding extra code in that application that will serve as a backdoor or introduce malware or something like that. So you definitely don't want pirated applications on any device that a user is working from. No antivirus software installed or outdated antivirus software, which is almost as bad as not having any at all. No device passcode, which would give anybody who happens to find a lost device instant access to anything on that device. And device sharing. So, for example, a user might use a particular device for both personal and business use, but also let their kids use that same device. There are also network-related vulnerabilities to think about. And I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this one, but public Wi-Fi is the thing that gets all the attention. We hear a lot about the risks associated with connecting a corporate device to a Wi-Fi network at a coffee shop or an airport or something like that, simply because those locations are frequented by cyber attackers. But public Wi-Fi certainly is not the only risk. If you've got a user who is doing work from home and their home network isn't secure, then that's just as bad as public Wi-Fi. You know, I can't help but think about someone that I used to live next door to years and years ago. And like everybody else, they had Wi-Fi, but this particular person's Wi-Fi router wasn't protected with a password. It wasn't locked down at all. It was completely open. And I tried to explain to them the risks that they were taking on by not having secure Wi-Fi, and it went in one ear and out the other. And the way that I finally ended up reaching them was I connected to their Wi-Fi network, and I sent a document to their printer and told them to call me. So that kind of got their attention, and we got that security problem straightened out. But the point being that if a user is working from home and their Wi-Fi network is completely insecure, then nothing going across that network can be trusted unless it's been encrypted independently of that network. So other software risks. Now, I mentioned earlier that a browser could become a problem if it has a lot of plugins or things like that, or is configured in an insecure way. But I said that there was another issue that made things just a little bit worse. And the problem with that is that a lot of browsers will support logons. And if you log into a browser, particularly the Edge browser, but there are others, then the default behavior can be to synchronize activity across devices. So let's say for a moment that you've got a user who has two personal devices. They use one primarily for personal-related stuff. They use another for mostly work-related stuff, even though it's their own personal device. And both devices, when they set it up, they entered an account, such as a Microsoft account or something similar, to set up the device. Well, what you could end up with is synchronization through the browser between the two devices. So you may have some work-related stuff that gets cached on the device that's used mostly for personal stuff, and vice versa. So certainly something to be aware of. So I've spent a lot of time so far talking about various risks. Let's get into a discussion of security best practices as it relates to remote and hybrid work. So the first one is always assume that the remote user's network is compromised. Yes, it's possible that the user may have a secure Wi-Fi router and that they never go to a coffee shop or an airport or anything like that, but it's best to just assume that the network has been compromised and to take steps to avoid sending anything unencrypted across that network. So as a best practice, always require the user to go through a VPN. And if possible, and this isn't always possible, but if possible, it's a good idea to make sure that users don't even access SaaS applications without first going through your VPN. So let's take a look at what that might look like. Now, I'm not trying to pitch any particular product or any particular solution. I'm only using this as an example. But here's a screen capture from Azure Active Directory, which Microsoft has recently rebranded as Microsoft Entra. Still can't get used to that one. At any rate, if you take a look at the screen, you can see that I've expanded the protection category, and I've selected conditional access to get to conditional access policies. Now, conditional access policies are essentially what-if statements. They allow you to go beyond basic access control list and set up conditions that you can test for and then take action based on the outcome of those conditions. So one of the things that you can do is you can set up named locations. You'll notice that we have a blue arrow on the left side of the screen pointing to named locations. And you can create a named location based on things like country location, IP address ranges, and things like that. So what you can do with those named locations is once you've created a named location, you can build policies around that. So let's say, for example, that you don't want users to be able to access your environment from anywhere except for work. Well, what you could do in a situation like that, and I'm not saying do this, but what you could do if that was what you wanted to do, is to create a condition based on location. And you could say that if it's not a named location, then just block access. Or another thing that you could do is you could grant access but require the app protection policy, or require the user to be using an approved client app or something like that. So the point being that you can actually take a look at where the user is logging in from, and based on where they're logging in from, you can make decisions as to, are they on the corporate VPN, or are they accessing this particular app from outside of the corporate VPN, and then you can make decisions based on that. So what are some other best practices? Well, one that I would recommend is to strongly consider using either VDI or virtual desktop infrastructure or desktop as a service, in other words, a desktop in the cloud. And there are several different reasons why I recommend doing this, particularly for remote and hybrid users. For one thing, it will get rid of all your cross-platform compatibility problems, because oftentimes applications are specific to a certain platform. It might be a Windows app or a Mac app or something like that. Well, if you're running all of those applications inside of a virtual desktop, it doesn't matter what type of device the user is using. They're viewing that virtual desktop through a remote session, so that gives them the ability to run applications that wouldn't ordinarily run on that device. Another thing is that if you're using VDI or desktop as a service, then that's going to force all of the users to go through the corporate VPN before accessing that virtual desktop. So that's going to improve security simply because you're ensuring that the connection is encrypted. So virtual desktops will help you to avoid a lot of the security issues that are associated with remote work. And at the same time, if implemented properly, they're also going to help help prevent users from storing any data on their personal devices. You're confining all of the data to either the virtual desktops or to the backend systems that those virtual desktops are connected to, which is the more ideal thing to do. Now, it's worth noting that virtual desktops don't address every device-level security issue. I mean, yes, if a user is working from a really insecure device and they access a virtual desktop and do all of their work through that, that's going to mitigate a lot of those security issues right off the bat. That's huge. Virtual desktops, if they're properly secured and maintained, will truly go a long way toward making your environment more secure. But it won't get around every device-level security problem. So let's suppose that a user is working from some device, and that device is infected with a keystroke logger. At a bare minimum, that keystroke logger is probably going to capture the credentials that the user uses to log into your corporate VPN. So at that point, those credentials are compromised regardless of whether you're using virtual desktops or not, because the compromise has happened before the user even gets to the virtual desktop. As another best practice, it's a good idea to adopt device health policies. So in other words, before a user connects a device to the corporate network, before it's allowed to access anything, you're performing a health check on that device to make sure that it's up to the standards that you've set. So let's take a look at how this might work. So here I am back in conditional access policies. This is the same mechanism that I showed you a few moments ago. And you'll recall the grant option that's in the lower left corner of the screen, where we granted it access to a resource based on a particular condition. Well, one of the things that we can do is we can look at the device platform. So if you look at the second column from the left, you can see that I've selected device platforms, and that takes me to a screen where I can select any device, or I can create a policy that's specific to Android, iOS, Windows Phone, Windows, Mac, Linux, or whatever. And then I can grant access based on what type of device the user is using. And if you look at the big blue arrow that goes all the way across the screen, one of the options is to require the device to be marked as compliant. So in other words, you set up policies, there's a check that happens to make sure that the device adheres to those policies, and if it does, then it's marked as compliant. And based on this policy, it's allowed to access the various resources on your network. So that raises the question of how do you mark the device as compliant? Well, the best way to do that in a Microsoft environment is to use the Intune Admin Center. So the screen that you see right now is just the dashboard view that comes up when you open the Intune Admin Center. And if you take a look at the third option from the bottom in the main pane, we have device compliance, and you can see that all of the devices at the moment are in compliance. And that compliance is based on the use of compliance policies. So I've gone to the home screen, clicked on devices, clicked on compliance policies, and there's an option right here to create a policy. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through every single option that's used in creating a compliance policy. But essentially, the way that this works is you pick an operating system, and then you choose the settings that you want to use for those operating systems. In other words, what settings need to be enabled in order for that operating system to be considered to be compliant. So just on this screen, you can see a few of those. With regard to device health, you can see that you can check to see if the iOS device has been jailbroken or not. You can also test for operating system versions. You can set a minimum or a maximum operating system version. You can set a minimum OS build version or a maximum OS build version. And there are plenty of other options. On this screen, for example, you can set a password policy for the device, so that way you can enforce the use of a password or a passcode on that device. And there are plenty of other options. And again, those options do vary based on what device platform you're creating the policy for. Now, it's important to note that these policies aren't just automatically applied for no reason. The policies are applied when the user enrolls the device for use with your work environment. So the thing about the enrollment process is that when the user completes that enrollment process, there's a bit of a trade-off that happens. On one hand, the user is doing what they need to do to be able to work from their own personal device, which is great. On the other hand, by doing that, they're giving up a bit of control over the device. So in other words, it's their own personal device, but they're relinquishing a little bit of control. They're telling the IT department, I give you permission to apply these different security controls to my own personal device in exchange for allowing me to access my work environment. So what you need around that is a BYOD, or bring your own device policy. And what I mean by that isn't so much a policy that you set electronically like what you saw on the previous screen, but rather just something that's written out that explains to the user what they need to expect. So that way it establishes what IT can expect, what IT is allowed to do, but also what the user can expect to happen on their own device. So when you're developing a BYOD policy, there are several things that need to be considered. And these are things that I'm a really big believer in. Most notably, being transparent about what is and is not going to happen on that device. I've talked to quite a few people over the years that are super paranoid about what the organization can see on their device. I hadn't really thought about this until just now, but as I think about BYOD policies and the potential for monitoring personal devices, I just can't help but think about something that happened to me when I was a kid. There was an incident with me and some friends, and nothing terrible, just typical childhood bad behavior. Let's leave it at that. And this happened at home, just me and a few friends in the backyard. Well, somehow or other, word got back to the school that I went to, and I actually got in trouble at school for something that happened at home. Well, I think there were a lot of users who were concerned about that same basic thing. Like, okay, this is my personal device. I do personal things with that device. But if I use that for work, can IT monitor what I'm doing personally with that device? And can I face any type of corporate discipline as a result of things that I've done at home on my own personal time using my own device? That's a very real concern that a lot of users have. So I think it's extremely important to be upfront with users about what the organization can and cannot do with regard to their devices. And what that really comes down to is what your mobile device management software is capable of doing. So in a lot of cases, that mobile device management software is going to be able to get the device name, its phone number, its serial number, the model name, the operating system version, the device phone number. Most of them can see what applications are installed on the device, the build number, and the MAC address. And for a lot of platforms, it ends there. But there are other monitoring platforms out there that will allow an employer to see things like personal email, calendars, contacts, text messages, browser history, and personal reminders and lists. So it's extremely important to let your users know what the organization can and cannot see, and to do it in just plain text rather than legalese that nobody can understand. So make it extremely clear what the user is agreeing to. And if the organization does change the way that they do things, do more than just display a generic, hey, we're updating our terms and conditions. Let the users know very clearly what that change is going to mean for them. It's also important to let the user know that even if the organization doesn't make a history or doesn't make a habit of monitoring anything personal, that there are situations in which their personal data could be exposed. For example, if the organization happens to be exposed to litigation, then you may end up running into a situation in which there's a subpoena, and that subpoena encompasses personal devices, and then all of a sudden the user's private information is exposed as a result of that subpoena. I have heard stories of that happening. It's also worth noting that bring your own device privacy laws tend to vary heavily from one state to the next. And you can also run into some pretty sticky situations if you have a user in one state who's working for a company in another state using a personal device, because at that point you have to figure out which set of bring your own device laws apply to that user. Another consideration with regard to a bring your own device policy is that device cleanup rules are essential. This is one of the big things that organizations often forget about. So here's the deal. Let's say that a user has a shiny new device that they want to use. They enroll it in your corporate network and begin working from that device. Great. Now let's say that a couple months go by and somebody releases a new device. So that user is super tech savvy. They go out and buy that brand new device the day that it's released, and they enroll that device and begin working from that, forgetting all about their old device. Well, normally that old device that the user had been working from that they're never going to use again, that stays enrolled on your network indefinitely. So anybody who happens to get a hold of that device can use it and access your network, assuming they've got the proper credentials. So what device cleanup rules do is they go and they check how frequently devices are accessing your network. And if you've got a device that hasn't been on in 90 days, 6 months, or whatever, you can automatically remove that from the list of enrolled devices. And so not only does that help to make things just a little bit more secure, it also makes management easier because you've got fewer devices that you have to worry about. And in some cases, that may even bring down your software licensing cost a little bit. There are also sometimes settings that you can use to limit the number of devices that a user uses. Like, okay, you've already got 5 devices that you're using. If you want to bring a 6th one on, you're going to have to remove one of the others. And then one more thing that I want to mention before I move on is that whatever management solution you use, remote wipe capabilities are an absolute must for any enrolled device. So if a user uses a device for work and that device gets lost or stolen, you need to have a way of issuing a remote wipe to that device so that you don't have to worry about the device becoming compromised. But remember, as important as device-level security might be, a lot of the vulnerabilities that I've talked about really come down to user behavior. In other words, what is the user doing with that device that could jeopardize your organization's security? And I've already been through the list, things like clicking on suspicious links, opening email attachments, weak passwords, reusing passwords, and so on and so forth. So what can you do about that? Well, a lot of this really comes down to your password policies and other mechanisms that are used to make sure that the user is not engaging in these risky behaviors. So what you see right here are the mechanisms that are built into Azure Active Directory, or Entra as Microsoft is calling it now. So as you can see, you can set a lockout threshold, the lockout duration. There's also a banned password list that is automatically in effect. In other words, it's a list that Microsoft maintains of passwords that users are not allowed to use to access Azure Active Directory. And that global banned password list is a closely guarded secret. Microsoft doesn't disclose what's on it or how they came about compiling that list. It's kind of a mystery. But that list does exist, and it's automatically in effect. But in addition to that list, you can also set up a custom banned password list. So if there are certain things that you don't want users using as passwords, for example, passwords containing the company name or the names of local sports teams or things that are super obvious, you can create that custom banned password list and keep users from using that. There are also third-party solutions out there that are really, really good that can check for compromised passwords, leaked passwords, and things like that. Another option is to use multi-factor authentication, and that's certainly something I would encourage anyone to do, with the side note that multi-factor authentication tends not to be quite as, what's the word I'm looking for? In other words, multi-factor authentication isn't completely immune from attack. There are ways of beating multi-factor authentication. Yes, it does help with compromised credentials, but it's not the be-all, end-all that it's sometimes made out to be. Biometrics can also be a good alternative to multi-factor authentication. Now, getting back to this slide that's being shown with the settings within Azure Active Directory. So as you can see, Azure Active Directory does provide some mechanisms that you can use to control the way that your users use passwords. But this probably isn't enough to fully address all of those issues that I talked about on the previous slide. So there are some other things that you can do beyond just using third-party software. One of the things that you can do is to use Azure Active Directory Identity Protection. And what that does is it goes and it looks for risky end-user behavior, and it enforces additional security mechanisms based on what the user has done. So you can use Azure Active Directory Identity Protection to detect things like leaked credentials, anonymous IP address usage, atypical travel. So if a user is logging on from a place they don't normally, or if they've done impossible travel, like one moment they're in your office and then the next moment they're logging on from halfway around the world, that's a problem. You can also detect things like signing in from infected devices, signing in from IP addresses that are known for cybersecurity or cyber criminal activity, and signing in from unfamiliar locations. You can detect all of those things. And if any of those are detected, then you can take action accordingly. Some of the things that you can do is you can force the user to change their password. You can completely block the sign-in. You can confirm that the user is compromised. Or you can just completely dismiss the risk, saying this is a false alarm and don't worry about it. So earlier I talked a little bit about end-user security training, and there were a lot of different ways that you can go about this. And when I talked about end-user security training earlier, I was mostly addressing it from the standpoint of having a big meeting where somebody goes on and on about security best practices. But that's not the only way to educate your end users. Another option is to use software to do it. For example, Microsoft's phishing attack simulator is a good start, and there are third-party alternatives to that as well. The basic idea is that you can launch your own benign phishing campaign against your end users. You can generate phishing messages that look and feel just like phishing messages that they would encounter in the wild, and there's a huge library of those to choose from. And you can see who clicks on them and then force them to do mandatory online security training based on whether or not they click on those phishing emails. You can also hedge your bets a little bit by using safe links and safe attachments. Safe attachments is a Microsoft 365 security mechanism that if a user attempts to open an email attachment, it will open that in a sandboxed environment and check and see if anything bad happens. Or actually, I believe that happens before the user ever receives the message. So if nothing bad happens, then the attachment is added back into the message and delivered to the user, no problem. If something bad does happen, then the attachment is obviously stripped from the message. And then safe links work similarly. In other words, Microsoft checks the link to see if it's anything malicious, and if it is malicious, Microsoft rewrites the link to go someplace safe. If it's not malicious, then the link is left alone. So there are a lot of third-party tools in addition to the ones that I've talked about that you can use to help with end-user security training and to kind of hedge your bets a little bit in case a user ignores that security training. And then one last thing that I want to quickly mention, because I'm just about out of time, that you might consider with regard to security is data loss protection. Now, data loss protection is normally used to prevent information leakage. For example, if an organization handles a lot of sensitive data, such as personally identifiable information, they'll very often implement data leakage protection as a way of keeping that information from being exposed outside of the organization. So let's say, for example, that you've got a user who routinely handles customer social security numbers. Well, you don't want that user emailing somebody's social security number to the outside world. So you can use data loss protection features to intercept any email that contains a Social Security number to keep that from leaking to the outside world. But the reason why I mention this is because data loss protection works by pattern matching. In America, for example, Social Security numbers have 3 digits, a dash, 2 digits, a dash, and then 4 digits. So there's a very predictable pattern that identifies a Social Security number. Same thing with a credit card number. Credit card numbers are 16 digits long, so it's fairly easy to recognize a credit card number. And there are a million other examples of that. As a matter of fact, Microsoft's data loss protection feature contains templates for a tremendous number of types of personally identifiable data, and not just in the U.S., for other countries around the world. So the reason why I mentioned data loss protection in the context of end-user security is because even though data loss protection is not designed to help out with passwords, in a roundabout way it can be used for that. Because think about this for a moment. Your organization has a password policy. There are certain values or certain conditions that must be met when a user sets up a password. Typically that password has to be a certain length. It has to contain a mixture of upper and lowercase letters, numbers, symbols. So in a roundabout way, if you know the password characteristics, you can use data loss protection to capture maybe not every instance of somebody trying to email a password or post a password to a SharePoint site or something like that. But you can recognize those patterns and catch most of them if somebody tries to leak a password through electronic means. So what happens if pattern matching does occur? What do you do in a situation like that? Well, there are any number of different options that are built into the software, and these options range from warning the end user to encrypting the message to removing the attachment, sending a copy of the message to a supervisor or to HR, or just appending a disclaimer to the message. Now, if we're talking about a password leak, then obviously you would want to warn the user and also notify a supervisor or HR or something like that. But having said that, I am just about out of time, so I want to hand it back to Chris, and I believe we've probably got some questions and answers.
Yeah, we got some good questions. Let's jump right in. Duke has a comment and a question for you. Authentication and allowing access is good. One challenge we often have is during terminations. Microsoft states it can take up to an hour to disconnect all access. That is a long period to have a remotely termed person retain their access. How can this be sped up?
Yeah, that really is a good point. Unfortunately, there isn't really anything that you can do to speed that up, but what I will say is that I tend to think of that 1 hour time period as being more of a Microsoft covering themselves than being realistic. Oftentimes that period is far shorter than an hour. One of the examples that I'll give, it's not exactly the same thing, but think about when you set up Microsoft 365. One of the things that you have to do is associate it with a domain, and you have to prove that you own that domain by going and adding a DNS record, and then it checks for the existence of that DNS record. Microsoft at one point claimed that would take 3 days to complete. Now I think it's a matter of hours. I forget what time period they're using now. But in my own experience, that usually happens just within a matter of a couple minutes, even though Microsoft says it can take up to this much longer period of time. So I think that the termination of access really kind of works the same way. Microsoft is telling you that it's going to take a lot longer than it really does. It just is kind of a way of covering themselves if it does happen to take a long time for some reason.
Okay, great. Sandra has a clarification question for you based off your demo you gave earlier. Once I click back the dialog box to allow my organization to manage my device, is there a way to unmanage their personal devices without having to contact each of them? We have a bunch of students whose personal devices are now in our Microsoft 360 Defender, and we just want to get them out.
Ooh, honestly, off the top of my head, I'm not sure on a definitive answer. I believe there is a mechanism in there that will allow you to remove devices without having to contact the person who owns that device, but I'm not 100% certain on that. It's one of those things I would have to go in and look. But I believe a mechanism does exist. If nothing else, you might take a look and see if there's a PowerShell commandlet that will do that, because it's entirely possible that even if no mechanism exists through the user interface, that there is a backdoor way of doing it.
Okay. Here's a great question. If I am using safe links, do I even need to bother with simulated phishing attacks?
I would say yes, because safe links isn't perfect. Certainly it makes a best effort attempt to protect you from users clicking on something malicious, but it's far better to prevent the user from clicking on something that they shouldn't in the first place. So I would do both. I would train the users to not click on things that they shouldn't click on, but I would also go ahead and enable safe links and just have that extra level of protection in case a user does happen to click on something.
Okay, Ken actually has he gave us a situation he's dealing with. Maybe you have some insight into helping him. Love AAD risk detections. However, we've seen impossible travel detections lately from users with WISPs like T-Mobile, who just changed their public IP, and according to Microsoft, that teleports them across the country. Not sure if it's more of a Microsoft or T-Mobile ASN registry issue with the inaccurate geolocations. Do you have any insight into this?
Oh, I wish I did. I've actually run into that exact same thing myself. Without giving too much information about the way that my own personal security is set up, I had a situation where I got an alert that a particular device had been used on a network in California, and when I dug into it, lo and behold, it was T-Mobile reassigning an IP address. So nothing had been compromised, and yet I got that false alarm. So I can definitely feel your pain on that one. I wish I had some advice for you on how to make that go away, but unfortunately, I don't know of anything.
Okay, let's get a couple more questions in here before the top of the hour. Can simulated phishing attacks really stop users from clicking on phishing messages?
I think that it really depends on how you conduct those simulated phishing attacks. It'll never be perfect. There's always going to be the chance that a user will click on something before they thoroughly read it, even if they've been well trained. But I do tend to think that going ahead and using the phishing attack simulator or a competing third-party simulation tool will help with that, simply because if you're letting the user know, hey, you click on this, you're going to have to endure this mandatory security training. Nobody wants to do that. It's one of those painful things that users would just rather not bother with. So, they might fall for the simulated phishing attacks the first couple of times, but if they realize that, hey, I'm going to have to sit through this training over and over every time I do this, and they know that you're not backing off on sending simulated phishing messages, they're going to be a lot more vigilant about looking out for those simulated phishing messages just because they don't want to have to sit through the security training.
Okay, let's end it with this question. Are there any best practices associated with simulating a phishing attack?
The main best practice that I would give you is to keep it varied. If you're going to use a phishing attack simulator, don't use the same phishing message each time. Don't even use the same type of phishing message each time. Mix it up, keep the users on their toes so that they don't know what to look for. And also be consistent about it. Don't ever let your users think, hey, they don't do that anymore, because that's when you can begin to start having problems with users not paying as much attention to real phishing messages. So my advice would be consistent and keep it varied.
Okay, great. Looks like that's all the time we have for this first session. Thanks for the great talk, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our Remote Workforce Security Summit, called the new best practices for remote/hybrid workforce security, brought to you by our sponsors Beyond Trust, PDQ, and Zoho. Our speaker for this session features Ian Thornton-Trump, Chief Information Security Officer at Cyjax and CTO of Octopi Managed Services. His 25-year career includes service in the intelligence branch of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserves, and the RCMP. He's been a cybersecurity consultant for both multinational and regional organizations, and today, as a virtual CISO, he helps both large and small companies build security operations and cyber threat intelligence programs. Ian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
I'm so excited to be here, David, and thank you so much for that warm introduction. I just need you folks to understand that this presentation is going to have some technical detail, but it's going to have some broad strokes on trying to find out how we got here, why things are the way they are when it comes to remote working. And I have to thank, the editors and all the people that go behind this for giving me the latitude to tell this story, because it's something that has been sort of burning in me for a while, and I now get to let it all out, as it were. So I hope you enjoy the next 50 or so minutes. We'll definitely leave some time for Q&A at the end. But I also want to point out that a lot of this stuff that I'm going to talk to you about, maybe I did need an actual caveat to say this is for adult audiences only. But some of this stuff is pretty heady stuff. It's going to be a bit difficult. It'll probably be a bit painless. A bit painful, because we are going to be talking about an acceleration of trends that we've seen in our societies, in Western societies and globally, about why remote working became a thing. And we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty details, and what I'm going to show you in terms of some future forecasts might be a little bit unsettling for some audience. So please, relax, take it with a grain of salt, and understand that the story arc that we're talking about before we get into some of the technical nitty-gritty is really about the current human condition. Now, why is this important? I want to set the scene for you first. Now, a lot of the Redmond Channel Partner stuff that we do, these things, we talk about zero trust, we talk about cloud security, we talk about, the four bad guy nations that are constantly attacking the G20 countries. I need everyone to kind of zoom out, and I mean like zoom out to the extreme zoom outs that we see on Instagram and other social media, because we're talking about the 8th place risk that's going to be with us in the next 2 years, but also the next 10 years. And that is cybersecurity risk. And it's really interesting to me that it stays in 8th place while a whole bunch of other things are swimming around and moving up and down in terms of their importance. But I think this will give you a perspective about the idea that remote working is really about a societal trend that is starting to happen, especially in the more industrialized nations, the more connected nations. But yet risk from the cyber perspective seems to remain the same. Now, what we have right now is some really interesting data coming out of the World Economic Forum that really talks about our current risk, which is the cost of living crisis that everybody is encountering. Remote working is kind of, I think, a little bit of an offshoot, a little bit of a creation, if you will, that the cost of living crisis is somehow intimately connected with the idea that we might be able to save money by doing something different, okay? And like I said, in the technical portion of this presentation, we're going to really actually zoom in to the advantages and disadvantages of remote working, because I'm going to lay it out for you in a very simple sort of way to understand. But as you can see these other risks, and if you think about like a boardroom, and you think about that boardroom being filled with all of your vice presidents and all of your stakeholders and stuff like that, if you break down a board meeting into 1 hour and you're totally seeing this cybersecurity picture, you have to come to the conclusion that that's like the 8th priority. So if there's 10 priorities and there's 60 minutes in a board meeting, with, of course, the loss of about 5 to 10 minutes as someone figures out how to use Zoom or Teams for the very first time. And to be fair, Teams is pretty straightforward until it's not, and it just seems to do random stuff, which there is no explanation for. It just sometimes doesn't work. But when you think about a board meeting where you have 6 minutes to articulate the entire cyber risk that an organization is in, contrasting that with some of the things that are at the top of the list, right, you'll then soon see the bigger picture, the bigger deck, if you will. So join me on this journey, if you will, to kind of understand some huge macro trends that we're faced with in this particular story arc, and then a bit of a reveal, if you will, at the end. So I almost wish we had some kind of cool music to play along with that intro. But the first thing we got to talk about is the problem with babies. Now, I am not anti-baby by any stretch of the imagination. They're super cute. There's not enough of them. Now, we have a major problem right now in a decline in the total fertility rate across this planet. And this is actually really, really interesting, and one of the major drivers to start looking at alternative ways of work, which would include remote working. Now, on that slide, there's a number of different lines, and all of them, even though some of them look like they're going up, that's not good, because the line that is actually going up is the number of deaths as a percentage of the population, the change, if you will, in the population, which also has the number of births descending, okay? And then at the bottom line, we have international migration. We are in a demographic spiral that is in a very precarious situation. And I have to say, first of all, as sort of my one attack on many G20 countries, that an immigration policy for semi-skilled or skilled labor right now has to be embracive, because we are simply, as a society, not producing enough replacements for some demographic trends that are truly frightening. Because even though we may be bringing in folks that are unskilled from other countries, but because they might be in a cohort that we actually literally have less people to do the job, all right, we need to start understanding that we have a huge demographic problem on our hands that isn't going away. We also have a problem with urbanization. And this is starting to become an extreme problem with everything from global climate change, which I will be mentioning in a little bit, and how that's going to be sort of the double whammy. And there is actually a triple whammy in this story as well. But one of the biggest problems that we're faced with is actual replacements for the amount of people that are retiring. So this next slide is a really interesting slide that I found that really talks about why hybrid working became such an interesting issue, because from essentially the 1970s forward, the net productivity of workers increased by 300% over the hourly compensation. Now, one can argue that the distance between net profitability and hourly compensation is largely profit-taking by the uber rich and the rich shareholders of a company. There's another dimension here, the technology dimension. You can see that with the introduction of the word processor and data technology and the rapid ascension of the difference between productivity and hourly compensation, we can see that our society has rapidly produced amazing achievements. And there is no other nation on the planet other than the United States when it comes to driving technology and building innovative things, even though they end up getting stolen by China. But my point here is that we have done some absolute amazing things, but we've become incredibly productive, but we have a problem in that a lot of that productivity is lost in underpaying people. Now, before you get confused and think that I'm advocating for a massive adjustment through some socialization policies and stuff like that, you are absolutely mistaken. I'm a capitalist. I work for companies as either a consultant or I sit in leadership positions within companies. And generally, our society is made up of this capitalistic model. This might be our great undoing in the following slides, which may throw a bit of a chill into the situation. Now, to be fair, the idea of productivity and technology-driven remote working has been around for us for a while. We called it something super lame called telework, okay, which was an awful way of saying it, because essentially back in the day, it was email was the only thing. We didn't have Teams. We didn't have Zoom. We didn't have really collaboration in the truest sense of what we did. In 2008, as everyone probably on this call knows quite intimately, we had a major financial crisis. One can also view the pandemic that we just got through as a major financial crisis as well. And this fundamentally changed our society in ways that we didn't really expect. I wrote an article pretty much the beginning of the pandemic that called this out, and it likened it to the barbarians at the gate of our Western way and culture and society that we've driven. Now, there was an actual rebellion that happened, and we're going to discuss what that rebellion looks like, because there were trends on this next slide that were completely beyond our ability to cope. Now, why is this slide so interesting? Well, it's what I like to call the German and Asian problem. The bullet points that I have on the left-hand side of your screen have massive geopolitical impact in all nations. Okay, so as you know, Europe, behind the United States, is one of the biggest part of the engines of our global economy. What this graph is talking about right now in Germany is that we're going to see nearly 50% of the German population will be aged between 40 and 65 years old, with only 16.14% ready to assume the roles that will be vacated by retirements and deaths in the elderly population. Okay? This is a major problem. This is actually a crisis that's demographic driven. We simply will not have enough people to fill and look after the elderly people that we have. So what, in a way, the pandemic did is it started a movement of remote working, because everyone on this call that is between 25 and 39 years old will eventually have someone that is very likely that they will have to look after. They will have responsibilities. This also goes to the idea that if you are going to create offspring between the ages of 25 and 39, which is ultimately probably the ideal time to procreate, other than if you're a Hollywood star, you are now into an actual situation where we will not have enough people to look after the other people. We will not have enough people to take over the jobs of looking after these people that have moved into the retirement and may have healthcare needs. That is the second problem that we're faced with. And this is happening in Asia. It's happening in Germany. It is not happening quite so badly in the United States for some societal constructs that already exist. But the retirement and aging of the baby booming generation is going to put a strain on social services. And that strain on social services will require an increase in taxes to meet pension fund demands. As more folks retire, there will be actually less working people in our society. So this is where I go back to that potential anti-migrant policies. We need more people. We need people that are in those brackets of the 21 to 24 and 25, 39 years old. They may not be skilled. They may not actually come with a advanced knowledge type of skill, but their children that they procreate will. So the actual demographic details that we have are scaring us, because what it's saying is within the next 10 to 20 years, we will now be in a position where there will be more aging population and retired people than there will be actual working people paying taxes to fund those liabilities. This is where the worker, us folks that are working for a living right now, have leverage to demand a number of different things. Maybe some things that address that ridiculous profit and efficiency increases that we've had. But I think when you look at the overall numbers that I'm seeing, to be fair, the demographic picture that I'm now being made aware of through my readings and research for this presentation are scaring me far more than this. And this climate security threat profile is also a major, major factor, because the people that are in those very high catastrophic effects of global climate change are going to be coming to our countries, whether we like it or not. The migration problem that we have is driven by a number of factors, and not the least of which is food insecurity and the threat to the global food supply. Now, by now, you're like, what did I just sign up for? What, Ian, what the heck are you going down this crazy road right now? What I'm trying to do, folks, is put on this hat and understand that it's not a conspiracy theory. And I will get into the conspiracy theory that I do have about all of this, but it's not a conspiracy theory. These are the numbers that are out there, and it's going to have a profound effect on society. And what is driving this is a number of demographic folks, a number of risk assessments in terms of the impacts of global climate change, the aging population, the distance between our workforce in terms of what they can afford and what they cannot afford because of the profit-driven corporations that we have. We are in a position where we have a triple whammy, that the third part of this equation might be the truly scary thing. We literally are going to have less people, more people that aren't necessarily contributing to the workforce, and a whole pile of folks fleeing the effects of global climate change arriving on our doorstep. And we have built something that could literally set the whole house on fire, okay? And that is this. Okay, we, in a lot of cases, our banking system, our venture capital and private equity capitalistic system that we have is setting us up for a massive failure that's going to make the 2008 financial crisis look like a blip in a park. We need remote working because many of us are going to be working a lot of jobs, not simply to afford the type of lifestyle that we love, but because the economy is now changing in the 2020s into a decaying economy for reasons that we can't control, for reasons that our society has set up and believe that the idea here is that large, expensive cities with decaying infrastructure are suboptimal for raising families and trying to work. No one in London wants, and it is where I live outside London, no one wants to do commuting anymore because it's a miserable experience. It's even more miserable when I live in a country that is essentially outlawed air conditioning like the Taliban, okay? We are in a situation where our city, our major city, the crown jewels of the United Kingdom, the capital of the British Empire of old, is in a really rough shape. So we have these propaganda pieces coming out about return to work because the sandwich shop that is, feeding all of the folks that are coming into work every day is suffering. It's not I'm going to say an existential threat, but it's proving that the experience of being in a major metropolitan and urban area is just nearly impossible when you can save and have a better quality of life in other places, and you are needed. Your skill set is needed. And it's desperately needed and will continue to be needed. So remote working now is a leverage of kind of the working class, but in another way, it's an opportunity to remake a lot of the ideas. And I'm a Canadian, so I have a very personal story in this. In Canada, we adored anything related to the United Kingdom because we're a Commonwealth nation and we never fought a war to punt the British out, which ultimately seems like a good idea if you look at the level of dysfunction in our own government. But what was interesting is we idealized what was going on in the UK. But I think what we see now is a real trend in that the UK is becoming a difficult place to live in the center of the universe, and that the best relationship you can have is somewhat outside of that universe, close to, to live the London experience but not have to pay the London prices. Now, why am I pointing this out in the context of remote working and debt-funded commercial property? I will answer your question now. It goes something like this. When you build your first building, you scrape together whatever money you can find and whatnot. You fill that building with tenants, and then you use the value of the property that you've built and those leaseholds that you have for the tenants, and you build your next building by taking the debt and financing it over and over again. So eventually you end up with a huge portfolio of buildings. And venture capital companies and hedge funds and banks come along and say, you're really successful. You've built 25 buildings over a span of, say, 50 years. And, you know, it's amazing how much money you have, but it's a hollow man. The problem here is $6 trillion in outstanding commercial real estate debt. And if you argue with me, you can see we have two problems. We have that $8 trillion number that everybody likes to talk about in terms of the cost of cybercrime, but you also have a $6 trillion bubble in commercial real estate that's debt funded, right? And as they like to say, it's time to pay the piper because no one is buying commercial property and signing leases anymore because it turns out remote working is a viable way in a knowledge-based economy, which generally speaking, all of the G20 nations have morphed into as we've outsourced our manufacturing to offshore. We can see that back even in 2020, we were looking at near 100% vacancy rates in the occupancy in 10 major metros in the United States. We are now just somewhere tracking around 50%. That's not viable to continue the cycle of debt-funded real estate. This is why we have this propaganda from the mayor of London, from political folks, from quasi, I'm going to say qualified analysts. And it's amazing to me that all these stories that you read in the news are all about, the folks that, probably have millions of dollars in the bank. And if I do sound a little bit socialist at this point, which is not necessarily a bad word, but I am going to say to you that the common person here is suffering because of this gap between the level of productivity that we've created in our society from technology and the compensation that's going on. And this is actually the crux of the matter. This is the conversation that's happening in the pubs and in the other various places, in family gatherings and stuff like that, right? Tech worker shortage? No. Worker shortage. All the demographic numbers I've looked at, the impact of global climate change, etc., anti-immigration policies are setting us up for a massive collapse in that particular society, which does put amazing stress on families. One of the arguments about having a family right now is we've created this thing where the only way to afford the house is quite possibly to have a double income. This happened as a result of the various societal trends that we saw as the price of housing continued to accelerate way faster than the price of wages. Now, this was probably the most interesting piece of research, and I deep dived into it because, folks, I could not really believe what I was reading of the idea that there is $8.5 trillion, which again is more than that $8 trillion in cybercrime. This is the macro thing, right? If you're going to lose $8 trillion to cybercrime, but there's $8.5 trillion sitting there in unrealized revenues, it means we could be $0.5 trillion up, and that the actual cost of cybercrime wouldn't really matter. But we need more people. We need to mentor. We need to help. We need to onboard people into whatever job that you're doing. And it's that immigrant story that is so famous in the United States' development of folks coming over here with nothing and making everything that is so vital right now in terms of our society. Now, I've ranted at you for 25 minutes now. And what I want to do is now ask one single question of why should I care? And Jack Sparrow is exactly the personification of what I'm about to lay on you when it comes to remote working. And if you think that was a tough segue, well, I'm sweating a little bit. And it's mostly because I'm so passionate about this. So we have to understand that in our society, one of the things that we go back to is essentially the human condition about we love to be social. We have social animals. I remember when I come onto these calls, we have great banter with John and David and Kishana and the rest of the team before we even launch these things. We talk about, what's on our minds, and we make jokes, and we really push the spontaneity of ideas up. That's super important. Now, what's really interesting about this is that there are some pros and cons to everything, right? There isn't a single solution. But one of the things that I'm saying right now, and I'll go on the record saying it, if you're going to have elderly people that you're responsible for, you absolutely will have to embrace remote working. And whatever organization, unless they feel like they can just lose you and you're just going to go and find another job, which you'll be able to because there'll be tons of jobs available, you're in the driver's seat now. It may not happen like this year or next year, but there's going to be an awful lot of opportunity space, and you have to prepare yourself for this. Now, I'm not going to read out every single one of those, but I want to point out a few things. Yes, being in a home office, as we all learned, had its pros and minuses during the pandemic. But some of us now prefer to work remotely because we can get more done and we're not distracted by people coming into our offices, or we're not distracted by shared workspaces or things like that. But I think also one of the biggest things that we can do is we can leverage knowledge in other people in other locations. We can do 24/7 by 365 coverage globally by diversifying how we deal with information and use information. There are so many interesting opportunities that working remotely embraces, but also the caveat here is that some people really require face-to-face. I'm going to just go out on a limb and say performance management over a Teams call with a terrible internet connection will end in tears, okay? There are some things that we actually have to be face-to-face with an individual, because there's also some things that we don't want to put in chat. We don't want to be recorded saying. It's just a fact of life that sometimes to build trust, you actually have to have a circle of non-surveillance, of the ability to take somebody for a coffee and ask what's actually going on. So hybrid working, which is sort of like a new sort of modification, which we're trying to do. It's sort of like we gone full tilt with remote during the pandemic, and now we're going full tote on back to the office, understanding that many of the companies have exposure because they have massive investment portfolios in the actual buildings that they own. And they want everybody back in the office, because if everybody isn't going back to the office, they're losing money because they shifted around through different companies. But the idea here of hybrid working still requires a completely remote working infrastructure that also can then adapt and change to the traditional kind of moat, firewall, internal networking. They say that the perimeter has died. I think that's true, and I certainly talk about this on our Zero Trust and our cloud security type of lectures. But I think, from my perspective, what I'm seeing right now is challenges in organizations that really are not bridging this gap particularly well. Ordering people back to work is a terrible idea. Incentivizing people to go back to work is, I think, a better idea, and that should be based on the individual characteristics. But then we look at the potential panacea of remote working. Some people say it saves on rent. This is mostly because it's combined with the save on commuting costs. Having seen, because I'm a huge fan of Vanderpump Rules, having seen the type of congestion that happens on American superhighways, or actually even trying to get out of San Francisco after landing at the airport and renting a car during rush hour, it's absolutely ridiculous. Some folks argue that it saves time because of terrible public transportation reliability and that they don't have to do a compute in the morning, right? Potentially encourages more communication, better work-life balance, which has been linked to the idea that you have better performance from your team. And then, of course, when we look at things like unexpected costs, because you're already able to be in a place where you have your resources that you need if there's a particular situation. And actually, remote working has been proven to encourage loyalty to your actual employer, allowing you that flexibility, allowing you to be able to, provide for others, provide for your family while still contributing and earning your salary. What was really interesting, though, is when you look at the number one risk that the World Economic Forum presented, it talked about the crisis in sort of cost of living issues, especially in the UK after a ridiculous Brexit experiment. What we found is that avoiding computer costs, but the increase in heating and energy bills, actually the computing costs, commuter costs into a workspace, right, was actually less than the actual energy increases that we face during the coldest periods of the year. This is that link back to remote working and global climate change, which I talked about. So I think when you start looking at this, we just have to go back to the famous 90s Depeche Mode, people are people. We're built all differently. We all have different backgrounds and different responsibilities. So the one-size-fits-all idea of remote working or you must be in the office works for some people, doesn't work for other people, so we end up kind of at hybrid working, and we will get into the IT piece of this in a moment, but has to be underscored and underlined by this particular fact. Your personality determines if you can work remotely. This was a peer-reviewed study published in Psychology Today about understanding employee personality traits are the key drivers of performance differences when it comes to hybrid work. Obviously, right? But this is our biggest stumbling block. The Microsoft research found that 85% of leaders say that the shift to hybrid work has made it challenging to have confidence that employees are being productive. I hate to tell you this. We're already at 300% productive versus wage. You know what? What do you want? 305%? 295%? Like, we're being ridiculous at that point. What we're failing to do is help people who have different needs, different psychological profiles. What we're trying to do is put everybody in the same box, right? Like when you go to Canary Wharf on the train, you see everybody is in the same blue suit with the same white shirt, with the same blue slacks, with the brown wingtips, okay? It's like there's this machine cranking us up. We're actually very different people. Everybody is different. So hybrid working, remote working, or in the office, all of these working modes need to be accommodated. That's the ultimate challenge for IT. And that is why we think it may be mission impossible. All right? It may be. Now, I'm going to pivot now, and I'm going to start going into the hardcore stuff about the cybersecurity piece of this as we start winding this down. But let's look at this particular trend that I found when I was doing the research for this thing. And this is like really fun. 1980s and 1990s, which arguably had the best music ever, before it got kind of weird in the 2000s to 2010s. But also, this is the evolution of what we're seeing in terms of cybersecurity attacks. Now, from 2010 to 2020s, we had these strategic attacks, right? Bots and supply chains. That's old. We're still talking about supply chain attacks because they're happening nearly every day, and stuff on critical infrastructure. Every so often, CISA or DOJ comes out with a big report that says, all of our energy-producing infrastructure has been infiltrated by cyber bad guys. I gotcha. I hear that. Okay? But of all the attacks, of which I am aware of, and in only one case so far has ransomware claimed a life of a person in Germany that was basically on their way to the hospital. A ransomware attack happened. They couldn't access medical records, and that person sadly passed away. Possibly from underlying conditions or possibly not. We don't know. But, it was convenient to blame the computers. That's a trend that we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. We're going to see in the 20 and 30s all sorts of scary stuff related to types of attacks. They're saying AI enabled, but I have a different view on that particular aspect of it. But what we're going to say is we're going to see more potential cyberkinetic type of attacks in our society. So the stakes have never been higher, okay? The stakes have never been higher in terms of trying to figure out what the direction of travel is in terms of our society and in terms of our geopolitical realities that we're living in. There are people out there, newsflash, that aren't fond of us, okay? And especially, and I will now go to my Canadian context, because if you're trying to place my accent, it is very much Canadian. When we have the Canadian leader trying to call out India on a special operations assassination of what they consider to Sikh terrorists on Canadian soil, it turns out from a cybersecurity perspective, that was a terrible idea, because Canada and the 30-odd people that we have that are the cyber defenders of Canada and the law enforcement and intelligence capabilities that we have are nowhere close and up to the fight that Cybercom, the NSA, and all the other three-letter government agencies in the United States have in terms of fending off major cyber attacks, right? Because some leader opens their mouth, the next thing we know, we've got a world of pain coming at us in Canada, all right? So we'll be reaching out to our American brothers and sisters and saying, can you please help us out? And for that, we'll give you a deal on softwood lumber. But my point here is that the threat landscape is increasing. We're having a problem with less workers in general, which impacts the less IT workers. And in order to retain both IT workers and regular workers, we need hybrid working, remote working, and potentially on-premise as well. Now, we get into the nitty-gritty here, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on these particular talking points, all right? Absolutely no more untrusted services on the internet, full stop. In the words of Taylor Swift, we are never, ever, ever going to expose non-encrypted services on the internet. You guys can quote me on that. But we need VPNs when we're doing things with infrastructure. VPNs are the major answer to the major problem in terms of keeping our information safe. Whether it's accessing privileged information, whether it's authenticating into the core of a network to make changes, whether you're a software developer. I don't want to see development and staging areas all open to the internet that are accessible remotely without, with SSH, with single factor authentication in front of it. That's like a suicide mission. Okay, you may as well douse yourself in gasoline and set yourself on fire, because you know what? Honestly, that is just a target waiting to happen. And it's a target waiting to happen because we're notoriously bad with good passwords, solid password hygiene. MFA absolutely needs to be part of your VPN authentication scheme. And we need to keep those things patched and updated, because otherwise we see threat actors tearing apart Fortinet, a Sonic Wall, D-Link, Cisco, even the storied brand of infrastructure, endpoint, routering, firewalling, and VPN concentrations of Fortinet, of course. We see these machines need to be kept up and dated. They are more important than your servers. They are more important than your workstations, because they're notoriously easy in some cases to exploit if they haven't been patched and updated, but also there are things that are commonly looked at as a SEP, someone else's problem when it comes to vulnerability management. So absolutely all of those network devices that are, especially if they're exposed to the internet, have to be priority number one, because if you lose one of those, the next thing that's going on is a bad guys in your network, and it has persistence because they own your edge device. It's a terrible idea. Again, when you're looking at remote networking, what you're essentially doing is when you do have remote workers, you are creating a branch office of your company on somebody else's infrastructure. So you basically need to plead and beg and help them and work with, your own IT support people to secure that networking layer so that you have a hope. Because if that person's end user devices are owned, there's a good chance that a lateral migration by a threat actor will take place and it'll come right in. And that's where we get that 2023 cost of data breach from IBM. I always treat these with a grain of salt, guys, because when it says the word IBM, it's probably going to be a bit of a self-serving document because the only people that input into the actual document is, the company that is sponsoring the actual study. But that 600,000 is a really interesting thing because what they're talking about is the additive value of if you're having to support remote working. Now, at first, when I read that stat, I got really offended by it because I was like, yeah, these people are just poo-pooing. But hear me out on this. If you have a lot of legacy technology in your infrastructure and you're relying on people working remotely, you're actually setting yourself up for failure. Okay? Because what's going to happen is that legacy technology stuff that you have that somehow was out of scope of your vulnerability management and your pen testing, because nobody apparently in the history of MoveIt appliances decided to run SQL map against it and find the actual vulnerability that the Clop ransomware group is using. That never happened. Are you out of your mind? This is legacy technology. Or Barracuda ESG. I could go all day on this stuff, folks. What I'm saying is that the legacy edge of your network is the most dangerous thing that you have out there for anyone, for remote workers or threat actors. It doesn't matter. It is the major problem in cybersecurity today is somehow people ignoring what CISA puts on their common exploited vulnerability list called the KEV, and somehow we're just not paying attention. We put that a rule on our inboxes and sent that stuff to spam, where it's actually the most important data that you can get to drive your threat intelligence as well as your vulnerability management program. The other huge thing is when we're dispersed. And it's really almost that collective Roman legion type of thing where if you have your shields locked and you're in the tortoise formation, you're a really tough nut to crack, right? That's because you got communication to the left of you, communication to right of you, communication behind, and if you're in the second rank, communication to the guy in front of you, which you're supposed to step into if that person goes down. But the point here that I really want to pick out of all of this is the out-of-band authentication. Most of the fraud and business email compromise that's coming after an organization is really hitting you in that social engineering area. When we see the compromise in a lot of cases of these big organizations, there's a social engineering component that hits us. And what is really super interesting about this is I just got a phishing attempt today where it was an overdue accounts email. It was, from a crap email address, so it really stood out right away. But what was really interesting about this one is when it came in my inbox, I have preview on in my inbox, it tried to execute a JavaScript in my Outlook without even opening the email and without even, this was the scary part, folks, without even downloading any of the images, okay? Now, that to me was a super scary moment, and I worked for a threat intel company in one of my roles, so I sent that off to the guys, and I said, tear into this, because I haven't seen a phish like this that would execute in the preview piece of it, and my EDR solution that I had deployed actually prevented that script from running and potentially downloading the second stage of the payload. Okay, so we're coming down to the end here, and I want you guys to watch the dog because the dog doesn't know what they're doing. And I actually, when I wanted to sum this up, I wanted to kind of give some people hope, is because the solution to not knowing what you're doing is really about finding and seeking the knowledge. So here's how we win the hearts and minds. Tools and policies are part of this, but more important, trumping all of what I'm going to put on this particular thing, okay, that was probably not a great word to use, but at the top of all of this is be customer service focused. Understand the employees, their needs, and all the other things that they're providing to the organization, and go the extra mile, right? So have the tools, advocate the tools to actually do remote support, right? Do you have the ability to provide remote support to corporate access, to corporate asset, to help the person so you can see on their screen what they're seeing and help them accordingly? You know, do you have, are you able to open service tickets and JIRA tickets remotely? And do you have that protected by 2FA or MFA? Because that's another portal that the social engineering attacks will quickly exploit and come in to your organization by exploiting those services that you have that actually help people create user accounts. And that's why some pretty big businesses got owned, because the bad guys figured out how to get into the service desk system and actually open up a ticket and get a password reset on an account by doing an impersonation attack, right? Including voice confirmation, because they had done an S7 vulnerability and taken over the person's cell phone. The other huge thing about the condition of people is one-to-one calls, no agenda. Let's just catch up. Let's have a virtual coffee together. Tell me about your woes and needs. This should be happening at all levels of your organization, from your to your boss, to your boss's boss, to your team, and whatnot. One-to-one calls, really, really important. Not to harass people about deliverables that they haven't got around to doing yet. It's not a performance management call. Let's call it a check-in, a human condition. Consider policies around internet reimbursement for employees. Again, the major risk in employee and business right now in the cost of living crisis. So that's another really, really important thing to consider. Make sure there's a clearly defined escalation process and procedures laid out so that if a person is in a jam, they know what resources they have available, whether that's an EAP, an employee assistance program, or, you know, even, God forbid, you have to call HR and plead your case to them. The other thing that I think is really, really important, as a cybersecurity person or as a IT person, be at the CABs, be at the architectural review boards, because that's how you get an idea of what's actually going on from any major project initiatives they are actually part of. It's all about communication. And, you know, I like to say these are the throats that you're able to choke, you know, laughingly, maybe a little bit sinister and creepily laughing. But CAB and ARB are where the action are. That is literally what's going to happen next. So if you're in there and you're good to go, you will get an idea of how projects are going in your organization. And finally, before that dog gets super annoying, the contact information for the ISPs, the software providers that people are using and stuff like that. Now, why do I say this? Because your ability to help someone is directly proportional for you to eliminate the factors that may be troubling a particular individual. Because there's been a lot of cases where you'll see like line droppage because like water got into the DMARC of a remote client and they're unable to maintain a VPN connection, or they keep getting disconnected from their RDP session, and it's a chronic issue. It might not be any of the technology of the business, but if you can help that person contact the ISP because you have the technical language and you can ask the tough questions and you work for a great company that knows what they're doing, you can now put the burden of the help that that person requires back on their internet service provider to get results. Because sometimes the problem isn't between the person and the keyboard. The problem is the infrastructure that they're running on. A simple change to public DNS might make a world of difference in what that person can access within that particular business. So, a bit of a mic drop, a bit of a wild narrative. I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and let's bring back the world famous David Remmel to kind of rally the troops here and talk about some of the issues that they're thinking.
All right, great job. introduce some socioeconomic concerns we haven't had to worry about before. So thanks for that.
Oh, yeah, that's just the value I bring.
All right. We got time for a couple of questions. Let's get right to them. Ian, we make extensive use of RDP environments protected by MFA. What else do you recommend for securing the infrastructure?
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing, and these are the sins of the past coming back to haunt you. Now, first of all, let me tell you, I applaud you for using MFA. Okay, that's awesome because that's a lot of the attack surface. The number one thing is to train your customers when weird things are happening, like if they get constant prompts for MFA authentication. That is the Alamo at that point, because you know that the bad guys are one step away from that person getting angry that that MFA prompt keeps interrupting them when they're on their first date, right, or something like that. That is an immediate problem. You guys have to have password lockouts. You have to have, after 3 or 4 unanswered MFAs, lock the account. That's probably one of the things and the feature that you need, because if MFAs are going unanswered, then you know that the password and the credentials have probably been compromised. The other thing to make sure, too, is get that EDR, XDR, whatever you want to call it, DR, on that RDP endpoint to make sure that nobody's uploading Mimkats and other hanky tools to start hacking your RDP, because your RDP will have not just that one person's credentials on it, but a whole bunch of credentials on it. You got to protect the kind of enumeration that can happen if you lose an RDP to a threat actor. It's the crown jewels, really, or access to the crown jewels.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question in order to give the audience a 5-minute break before the next session. So the question reads, if a device is compromised on a home network, can something make its way into a corporate environment? How can we prevent that?
Yeah, 100%. One of the most effective things that you guys can do is offer folks an antivirus solution. Maybe you want to make a part of your EDR. Maybe you don't want to make a part of your EDR, or have a separate bucket for customer EDR devices, like your own personal devices, because you have to detect an attempt for something laterally moving, just like you would within your own network, right? You want to be able to set up the same kind of approach to that particular device and attempt to compromise it. The other really great thing you can do is run the IP address of the remote connection. So if I'm working at home, I'm presenting my IP address to the business, right? They see the connection that I'm connecting to. Run that through a threat intelligence feed, because if it's dirty, that IP address might be already on someone's list, like Gray Noise or Virus Total, as a compromised endpoint running a C2 or attempting to infect other things, because it won't be infecting just that device that's inside that local area network. It will be attempting to affect other devices across the internet, because generally the security settings on any router that is part of your home networking are set to allow any traffic out, unless you've locked it down. But generally, they will let anything out, and that IP address may have hit some honeypots, may have hit some threat intel firms, and is now flagged as being sketchy. And then you can go into a little bit of helping advice to that particular customer to say, listen, something in your network is polluting. It's not only attempting to infect your corporate asset that you have on your home network, but it's also probably trying to infect other things on the internet. So let's get that cleaned up.
All right. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Ian, for a great presentation and answering those questions.